On December 1st, 1991, 21-year-old college student Tommy Burkett was found dead in his bedroom, a revolver by his side. The official police narrative was delivered before the blood was even dry. A tragic, open and shut suicide. But the truth hidden behind the police tape is terrifying. Tommy was brutally beaten, his jaw fractured and his ear mangled before a bullet ever entered his body, and the police knew it. The proof isn't just in the horrifying second autopsy photos. It's in the deliberate destruction of the original crime scene evidence, the vanished investigative files, and the documented ties between local law enforcement and a violent drug syndicate Tommy was actively trying to expose. Today, we are going to dismantle the impossible timeline, expose the authorities who swept a brutal homicide under the rug, and reveal exactly how the justice system protects its own when a civilian gets too close to a protected truth. Tommy Burkett was not a kid spiraling into despair. He was a bright, engaged student at Marymount University in Virginia. He had a tight-knit relationship with his parents, George and Beth Burkett. He had plans, he had a future. But in the autumn of 1991, a dark, creeping paranoia began to infiltrate Tommy's life. He told friends he was being followed. He changed his daily routines. He expressed deep, specific fears about certain individuals on campus who were heavily involved in the local narcotics trade. To understand the sheer magnitude of the betrayal that was about to unfold, you have to understand that Tommy wasn't just a bystander. He had become a liability. He had uncovered a sprawling, lucrative drug operation moving through his university, an operation that, as the evidence would later suggest, was operating with the tacit protection of local law enforcement informants. Tommy had been assaulted just weeks prior. His car had been vandalized. He was receiving threatening phone calls. He was a young man flashing warning signs in neon, practically begging the authorities to intervene. But when the violence finally spilled into his family's home, the police didn't arrive as investigators. They arrived as a cleanup crew. On the afternoon of December 1st, the local police were dispatched to the Burkett family home in Chantilly, Virginia. Tommy was found slumped against the wall in his bedroom. A .357 Magnum revolver was resting neatly nearby. There was a single gunshot wound. Standard operating procedure for any unattended death, especially a violent one, dictates a strict, unyielding protocol. The scene must be frozen. Photographs must be taken from every angle. The weapon must be bagged and tested for fingerprints, blowback, and gunshot residue. The hands of the deceased must be bagged to preserve trace evidence. The coroner must be called to the scene to conduct a preliminary examination of the body in its undisturbed state. The Fairfax County Police Department did none of this. Before Tommy's parents were even allowed to see their son, before a medical examiner ever set foot in the room, the responding officers made a unilateral binding declaration: suicide. The investigation was essentially closed within minutes of the officers walking through the front door. When George and Beth Burkett returned to their home, they were met with a wall of uniforms and a narrative that made no sense. The police were eager to clear the scene. The body was removed with shocking haste. The revolver was picked up, unloaded, and handled without any regard for latent prints. In fact, the police would later admit they never bothered to fingerprint the weapon at all. Why fingerprint a gun when you've already decided who pulled the trigger? But the Burketts knew their son. They knew his fears. They knew about the threats. And more importantly, they had eyes. When the police finally left, abandoning the house with jarring speed, George and Beth walked into Tommy's bedroom. It was a slaughterhouse, and it was a scene that completely shattered the laws of physics, if you believe the police department's official story. Blood was pooled in areas that made no spatial sense for a self-inflicted wound. There was blood spatter on the walls that indicated a struggle, not a static, seated suicide. Most damning of all, the Burketts found pieces of Tommy's fractured jaw embedded in the carpet, far from where his body had been resting. How does a single gunshot to the head shatter a jaw and scatter bone fragments across a room? The Burketts immediately called the police back, demanding they process the scene properly. They pointed out the scattered blood, the bone fragments, the physical impossibility of the room's layout. The police response was worse than negligent. It was actively hostile. The officers told the grieving parents to clean it up themselves. They refused to log the bone fragments as evidence. They refused to take photographs of the anomalous blood spatter. They simply turned their backs and walked away, leaving a mother and father on their hands and knees, scrubbing their murdered son's blood out of the carpet, picking up the pieces of his shattered skull that the justice system deemed irrelevant. This brings us to the pivot, the moment where sheer incompetence crosses the line into a malicious, calculated cover-up. If this were simply a case of lazy policing, the medical examiner's autopsy would have caught the glaring discrepancies. The autopsy is the ultimate fail-safe against bad detective work. But in the case of Tommy Burkett, the medical examiner's office didn't act as a fail-safe. They acted as a rubber stamp for the police department's fabricated narrative. The official autopsy report was a masterclass in omission. It noted the gunshot wound, confirmed the cause of death as suicide, and abruptly ended. It completely ignored the catastrophic trauma inflicted on the rest of Tommy's body. But George and Beth Burkett refused to be silenced. Driven by a grief that morphed into an unstoppable righteous fury, they obtained the morgue photos. What they saw in those photographs is enough to make anyone lose faith in the system entirely. Tommy's body was covered in defensive wounds. His right ear was battered, swollen, and mangled, commonly known as a cauliflower ear, a classic sign of severe, repeated blunt force trauma. His jaw was broken on the opposite side of the gunshot wound. Let that sink in. A man allegedly places a gun to his head, pulls the trigger, and somehow the kinetic energy bypasses his skull, travels to the other side of his face, and shatters his jaw with enough force to expel bone fragments across a room. It is a physical impossibility. Furthermore, there were deep, livid abrasions on the back of Tommy's neck and head, consistent with being struck from behind with a heavy object. There were contusions on his knuckles. This was not a young man who had quietly taken his own life. This was a young man who had fought for his life in a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle before he was executed. When the Burketts took this undeniable photographic evidence back to the police, demanding the case be reopened as a homicide, the system closed ranks. The police doubled down, claiming the jaw fracture and the mangled ear were somehow secondary anomalies from the gunshot. It was an insulting, medically illiterate lie, but they repeated it with the arrogant authority of a department that knows it answers to no one. The sheer audacity of the cover-up only escalated from there. The Burketts demanded to see the crime scene photos, the few that the police had allegedly taken before abandoning the house. The Fairfax County Police Department calmly informed the grieving parents that the photos had been lost. The negatives were gone. The physical prints were missing from the file. The only visual record of the original crime scene, a scene managed by sworn officers of the law, simply vanished into thin air. Evidence logs were mysteriously altered. The trajectory of the bullet, which the Burketts hired independent forensic experts to analyze, proved that Tommy could not have physically held the gun at the required angle to inflict the wound himself. The gun was wiped clean, not just devoid of Tommy's prints, but devoid of any prints, an impossibility unless the weapon had been meticulously wiped down after the fact. Why? Why would an entire police department, from the beat cops to the detectives to the medical examiner, risk their careers to cover up the murder of a college student? The answer lies in the dark, unregulated underbelly of police informants. Private investigators hired by the Burketts, along with independent journalists who began digging into the rotting foundations of the case, uncovered a terrifying reality. The individuals Tommy had been clashing with on campus, the ones running the lucrative drug ring, were not just petty criminals. They were documented informants for the DEA and local narcotics task forces. In the twisted, cynical arithmetic of the justice system, an informant is an asset. They provide the arrests that secure funding, generate headlines, and build careers. To a corrupt narcotics division, an informant is worth protecting at all costs. Tommy Burkett, with his threats to expose the campus drug ring, had become a direct threat to the police department's golden goose. When Tommy was murdered, likely beaten to a pulp to silence him, and then staged to look like a suicide, the police didn't see a victim. They saw a PR disaster. If their protected informants were charged with the brutal murder of a clean-cut college kid, the entire narcotics operation would collapse. Warrants would be scrutinized. Careers would end. So, they made a choice. They chose to sacrifice Tommy Burkett's justice to protect their own operation. They looked at a battered, broken young man, looked his parents in the eye, and lied. They weaponized their badges to protect a cartel operating in their own backyard. Faced with a local police department acting as an accessory after the fact, the Burketts made an agonizing decision. 2 years after burying their son, they had Tommy's body exhumed. They hired Dr. Cyril Wecht, one of the most renowned and uncompromising forensic pathologists in the world, to perform a second, independent autopsy. Dr. Weck's findings completely obliterated the official police narrative. He officially documented the fractured jaw, confirming it was the result of severe blunt force trauma inflicted prior to the gunshot. He documented the battered ear. He documented the defensive wounds. He unequivocally stated that the physical evidence was highly inconsistent with suicide and strongly indicative of a brutal homicide. Armed with the findings of a world-renowned pathologist, the Burketts took their case to the highest levels of power. They bypassed the corrupt local police and went straight to the FBI and the Department of Justice. They presented the missing crime scene photos, the erased evidence logs, the impossible blood spatter, the ties to police informants, and Dr. Weck's explosive autopsy report. They expected the federal government to swoop in, tear the Fairfax County Police Department apart, and finally deliver justice for Tommy. Instead, they hit a wall of brass. The FBI and the DOJ reviewed the overwhelming mountain of evidence proving local police corruption and murder, and declined to intervene. They cited a lack of federal jurisdiction. They cited a deference to local authorities. They offered a dozen bureaucratic excuses, all of which translated to one chilling truth: the system will never indict the system. The federal government looked at a blatantly corrupt local police force protecting drug-dealing murderers and decided it simply wasn't worth the political headache to expose them. The tragic legacy of Tommy Burkett is not just a story of an unsolved murder. It is a terrifying autopsy of American law enforcement. It is a documented, historical proof that the police can walk into a bloody, battered crime scene, ignore shattered bones and missing evidence, declare a murder a suicide, and walk away with absolute impunity. It proves that evidence can be destroyed, autopsies can be falsified, and grieving parents can be mocked and stonewalled, all while the federal government looks the other way. George and Beth Burkett fought for decades. They exhausted their finances, their health, and their lives trying to force the system to admit what the entire world could see. But the shield held firm. The officers involved retired with their pensions. The medical examiner faced no consequences. The informants continued to operate under the protective wing of the badge. When you look at the case of Tommy Burkett, you aren't just looking at a tragedy. You are looking at a mirror, reflecting a deeply broken, fundamentally unaccountable system. A system where the truth is whatever the police decide to write in their report, and where a citizen's life is secondary to a precinct's reputation. If you thought the blatant cover-up and destruction of evidence in Tommy Burkett's murder was a terrifying abuse of power, wait until you see what happens when extreme, generational wealth enters the equation. If a local police force will cover up a murder to protect their informants, what will a department do when a billionaire decides the laws of physics simply don't apply to his family? Click the video on your screen to see the impossible, locked room mystery the system tried to bury, and the elite family that bought their way out of a homicide.